Hi, and welcome to Classical Stuff You Should Know, a podcast about the classical world, classical education, old books, old things by young and handsome men.
Yeah, thanks. AJ got that wrong last time, so thanks for correcting that.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, appreciate
so
that.
we are not old anyway.
They can see us.
Oh, my word. You're right.
If they subscribe on YouTube.
I don't know what you're selling,
We
but
didn't
they can
think,
see
we
it.
didn't think
Search
this
YouTube
through.
for-
We didn't think this through. Anyway,
we use filters
we
for this
are
recording?
3 teachers, educators, same thing, at a classical school in Austin, Texas. My name is Graham Donaldson, and I am joined with AJ Hannenberg and Thomas Mangby.
Whoa!
Oh, hey.
Did not see
Got
that
to keep
coming.
the listeners on their toes. Change it
Seriously.
up.
Keeping me on my toes. That was terrifying.
We now do the end at the beginning. You can find us at classicalstuff.net. You can tweet at us at classicalstuff, CLSSCAL stuff on the twits. You can patronize us on Patreon by finding Classical Stuff on Patreon, and we've got some tiers
For
and some fears.
the fallen.
We got some tiers that you can subscribe to with prizes. Prizes?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're getting awards.
You're getting
yeah,
rewards.
rewarded. Yeah, I like that.
And that helps keep the podcast going and growing. We can do more stuff.
Yep.
cool.
And there's much more audio on there if you want to hear more from us.
That's right.
So
We
check it
do
out.
between episode banter where we talk about
Stuff.
maybe not so much current stuff, but we talk about stuff that maybe isn't really classical stuff. We spend a lot of time talking about the markets.
Our last two haven't been, though.
And then we also talk maybe about like demographics or
My favorite is when we just continue the conversation from the last episode.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And then just keep recording. Yeah.
Thomas and I probably banter about the fourth turning. We got to do it now.
Little bit, that happened, yeah,
Anyway,
for sure.
fun things. Okay. But I'm feeling pretty good.
Just like in general?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Thomas, I know you're feeling good.
I'm feeling good. Yeah, definitely.
Handberg, you feeling good?
Nah.
You're not feeling good? Well, maybe. So 66% of this podcast, I would say, are great men.
Yeah, great. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Graham, you and I are the great
We
men
are
of
great
this
men.
podcast. That's exactly right.
AJ's a normie. And
I exist mostly to reproduce.
he makes this mostly reproduce to just to sort of continue on the status quo. Whereas us great men,
Yes.
we have like a sort of a vision of the future, the way things ought to be.
And we should be able to do whatever.
We are willing to bring that future through a soft hand or a heart-clenched fist.
Yes.
But anyway, to quote one of my other favorite podcasts, I'm going to leave this in the cold hands and warm embrace of Mr. Hannenberg.
Why are my hands cold if my embrace is warm?
podcast are you
Do I have like
listening to?
circulation problems?
Seriously.
The cool hands and warm embrace?
Cool
I've
hands?
never-
Why are my
Yeah.
hands cold?
Yeah, seriously.
They don't question it on that podcast. They just start going.
I don't understand it. I'll be frank. I don't get it. My hands are very warm. Okay.
The warm hands and cool
My embrace is cold. It's
Is that
weird.
what it actually is?
Cold core,
Oh, there we
warm
go.
hands. Okay, so today we are talking about is it Fyodor? Not Theodore. It's Fyodor.
Fyodor with an F.
Fyodor.
Fyodor.
Dostoyevsky's book, Crime and Punishment. And the funny thing is, when I said I was doing this for the episode today,
Yeah.
both of my compatriots
Yeah.
were like, we've already done it. And they
Yeah.
thought we'd already done it because it just seems like one of those ones we should have done. We reference it. We reference the book all the time.
We
but
doom
we've
scrolled to find it and
Yes,
couldn't see
couldn't
it.
Yeah,
find
they both
anything.
scrolled. I scrolled this
Yeah.
morning to see if we had done it, and we hadn't. So it seems like it's about
Good to go.
time to do Dostoyevsky's Crime and Punishment. We do
Although-
it senior year.
Our goofy titles mean that control effing on a website is a little more difficult to find
That is
things.
true.
I hear your criticism, and I reject it.
Good. I appreciate that.
I like having silly titles, and I'm going to keep doing it.
You like calling our episode on poetry potty? That's a
I
thing
hear your criticism, and I reject it.
That's good.
So yeah, today we're talking about Crime and Punishment. So here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna give you a so basic outline of Dostoyevsky's life. I think you can find more of that on other podcasts where we talk about books Dostoyevsky has written, or you can just go to Wikipedia. Like,
Yeah, what are you
stop
listening
being
to?
stinking lazy. Go look him up.
Wait, no, listen to our podcast. No, listen to our podcast.
And then I'm gonna do. Here's how I've planned it in my head, and we'll see how it goes. Where I'm gonna kind of do a real basic summary of the book, but I'm guessing that most of you have already read it, or you're maybe a teacher coming here to learn more about it. And in that case, if you haven't, I'll give you enough to go on. And if you have, then I'll actually give you some content maybe you can teach to your students or may help to deepen your reading of the book. Because a lot of times when I do books, I just sort of summarize it. And that's super fun when it's goofy mythology that involves Thor in a dress. But it's not as fun if we're talking about Crime and Punishment, because the book is depressing. So
it's about crime and punishment.
it's
right?
about
Yeah, so,
crime
yeah.
and punishment. So here
Kinda.
are some basics about his life.
No, it's kind of depressing. There's
Oh.
Yeah.
I thought you were
pretty
saying it was
depressing.
kind of about Crime and Punishment.
Okay, so he was born in 1821 in November, and he eventually died in 1881, so that's a good 60 years. He was born to a father who was a doctor that eventually got his coat of arms, so he became gentry. So he was, he wasn't poor. His mom was really well learned, and he grew up learning from her about all kinds of writers and poetry and all kinds of stuff. And then eventually he went into, I think, a military school. And shortly after he got out of military school, he became a lieutenant and then did not like that very much and resigned and to commence a life living off of his pen. He wrote a short novella called Poor Folk and got immediate acclaim with some really important critics. And everyone was like, oh, he's like the next big thing. And then his next few novels were kind of flops. And then he was kind of sullen and withdrawn and not very friendly. And so everyone was like, well, Dostoyevsky, so they kind of booted him out of the circles. And then he got involved with a bunch of people who discussed utopian socialism. He became part of a circle. And as you can imagine, the Tsar, the head of Russia, was not super into ending serfdom and implementing socialism. And so they got in really big trouble. He got arrested and put in prison, even though he was pretty adamant that he was not about disseminating illegal propaganda, although maybe his friends were. He got outed, right, as being part of a dissenting circle. And so he goes to prison, and then they are basically sentenced to death, or at least that's the sentence that he receives.
Right.
He is carted to a village square and lined up to be shot by guns in a firing squad, and he thinks he's going to die. And so he is not happy about this, obviously. And right after, like, he was like second row, right? So the first row is up there about to be shot, and a guy runs up and he's like, the Tsar has just commuted your sentence.
So
just kidding.
So no one died.
Nobody died.
Okay. Yeah.
And then instead they all went to a work camp in Siberia. That's not just a funny joke. That's a real thing that Russia used to do. They used to send people to work camps in Siberia. So he went, and it was terrible. We're talking one bathroom for 200 people.
Gross.
We're talking, he had his first bout with epilepsy there. The sanitation was terrible. The food was awful. He only had, I think, a New Testament to read. Right.
Yep.
And then it was generally a really bad experience. He would eventually come out and write about it. The rest of his life is, while he was in jail, he becomes convinced that what's going to save the world are like the good down home values of the common man, right? Like good personal virtues, and enough with all this intelligentsia nonsense. All the smart people are trying to figure out how to make the world a better place. Yep. And they suck at it. And what's really going to be better is good people working hard, doing their own thing. And he is a gambler, and
so he became more conservative as he got older.
Yeah, I think so. And one of my favorite facts about him is that he was a pretty adamant gambler, and at one point he traveled and he was kind of leading this affair with this girl, and he promised one of his publishers that he would deliver a book in just an insane amount of time. It was like 2 months. And if he failed, then the publisher got all the rights to publish all of his previous material for free without paying him anything. So the publisher could just publish willy-nilly. And he hired a stenographer, and he pulled it off.
Good. Okay.
And
That's
I think it was
terrifying.
called The Gambler, weirdly enough.
That's funny.
And I think he actually eventually married that woman, and she kind of put his affairs in order and figured out his finances and helped him to become the writer that he now is. I'm sort of glossing over the rest of his life. It's pretty interesting.
Yes.
It's not the most interesting writer's life I've ever read, but it's pretty well up there. So that's Dostoyevsky himself. Okay. Some of those shades of meaning might come into play in the novel. So Graham, can you give me, I'm going to spring this on him. Sure. He doesn't know this is coming. Can you give me a 5-minute summary of sort of the ideas that were rising up in Russia at the time?
Oh, sure thing.
This is a lecture he gives to our students, so I figured he'd be okay with this.
Yeah, so you have in Russia, Russia's always kind of been a little bit behind, at least during the Enlightenment. Russia was always behind these other countries in terms of modernizing or getting out of a more medieval way of existing, a agrarian system. And so you had, the English Revolution in the 17th century or whenever it was. You had the French Revolution in the 18th, the 18th century. And Russia never really had it. But all of the intelligentsia or the bourgeois in Russia kind of cast their eyes towards the books that were being written in other parts of the world, and were trying to think of how they could apply it to Russia. Eventually, these more what eventually grew. These are sort of the seeds of communism. But what grew? I'm just trying to think of how to phrase it. An emphasis on seeing man purely as in a material way. Was popular and in vogue, and then how can we organize society with purely material people in order to better society. And so these ideas were hopping up of, well, we need to get rid of these old superstitious ways of kicking out the Tsar and kicking out this sort of divinely ordered kingdom. And if we just get the smartest and best people in centralized positions of authority, we can use modern science to better organize human existence. And this is sort of, what you would classically call a progressive idea in terms of human society. So this is that utopian socialism that we're talking about, that you organize men not according to a Christian cosmos, or you don't organize men according to a king, or even a constitution or a charter. You organize men basically by trying to focus it on materialistic scientific principles is probably how they would have described it. Really, it just sort of centralizes power into a ruling class that was ultimately utilitarian in nature. So if you need to kill somebody in order to bring more food to millions of people, you kill that person. Eventually, this gets turned into the communist revolution the sort of disenfranchised bourgeois wanted to be that ruling class, and they thought that you could do that by rousing the proletariat working man to overthrow the ruling class. Turns out proletariat working man doesn't really care about that kind of thing. Yes. But the disenfranchised bourgeois cares really deeply about becoming the enfranchised bourgeois and is willing to spill blood in order to do it.
And if they have to sacrifice the working man, they're going to do it.
If they're going to sacrifice some working men in order to have, sort of it be better in the future, well, then so be it. And that's eventually what ended up happening in Russia. So the ideas that were percolating along were sort of couched in a materialistic view of human nature and this sort of scientific determinism, as well as logical positivism, which we don't really need to talk about. But basically this view that there are better ways to organize society, and these smart people who are doing it based on pragmatic and utilitarian means should be the ones that are doing it. And it ended up being a very, very violent a very, very violent revolution, whereas the English and the French Revolution was violent, whereas the English one was pretty violent in England too.
Right.
But anyway, but all those revolutions had slightly different flavors to them based on how early in history they came. So yeah, that's kind of, was that enough for you to go off?
That was good. So we got socialism, we got communism, all of that is kind of on the rise and in vogue.
Yeah, and if we want to sort of define the terms, socialism ends up being that you have a centralized state control over resources, money, industry, and so you get the famous and 5-year plans, right? You have these sort of famous plans wherein you're going to pull the strings for everything. So you don't have a market that is determining how these things are working out. You have a centralized means of control of how these things are going to work out.
Cool. Perfect. That's good. Okay, so the novel opens and we are introduced to this character, Raskolnikov Romanovich.
No, Rodion
Romanovich
Raskolnikov.
Heck of a name.
Yeah, it's a lot of R's.
Yeah.
And so this, have you read the novel with us, right?
Not with you.
Separately?
I read it for Summer Bingo, not this recent one, but the one before.
Okay, so you're all over this.
Yeah, sure.
Can you describe? Okay,
I would. Yeah, you all should definitely do all that.
What do you remember? Do you like
about Raskolnikov?
How did you picture him? Yeah,
he's like disaffected, kind of idealistic guy. Doesn't have much direction in life, and is in his head too much.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is that too simplistic a description of him?
No, that's good. He's 23.
Yeah,
he's good looking. He's kind of dark-haired, dark-eyed, has a really silly top hat and then like all the rest of his clothes are in tatters. He doesn't have good boots. He's
naturally melancholy.
Yeah, I would say naturally melancholy is probably an understatement. At the point that we meet him, he is sort of like hiding in this tiny little cupboard of an apartment he has, like a spider, and just thinking all day. At one point, his serving woman kind of comes up and she's like, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm thinking. She's like, don't you want a job? And he's like, I have a job. She's like, what is it? And he's like, thinking. So that's what
he sounds like a lot of fun.
He
right?
was a student. He is no longer a student. We find out later that he couldn't make the payments, and so he stopped being a student. He doesn't have his degree, but there's sort of in Russia at the time, there's a status thing that comes along with being a student. If you're a student, everyone's like, oh, all right, so you're like the real deal.
Right.
So he still kind of has that going for him, but he never really finished the job.
Right.
He's a kid from a small town who's gone to the big city to go to college, and when he went to the big city in college, he got mean.
Was he not? I don't remember. Did they describe him before going to school? Was he not the way?
He was always a little bit sullen.
He was always a little bit
like
sullen.
prideful and thought himself above everybody else.
Okay.
But going to the big city and being like a hotshot philosophy
That changed
major
him. Yeah.
wasn't a healthy place to be.
Yeah. So a couple of things happen early in the novel that are important. One of these things is he meets a guy named Marmaladov. Now, Marmaladov is a kind of portly gentleman who drinks a lot and used to have a position in government, and now because of his desperate drinking, no longer has a position in government. Yeah. He's partially a holdover from what was originally a separate book called The Drunkards. And there were two books that eventually became one book. And so he is where, like, the book The Drunkards, I think, was going to focus more on the drinking issue, and drinking does pop up all over the novel, but it feels to me like Marmaladov is sort of a holdover from this, and his name literally means jam or jelly. So think about a large person filled with jelly that drinks way too much alcohol, and you've pretty much got Marmaladov. Yeah. He speaks in one of those dignified, like, "Come here, young man, I'm going to tell you my story," and tries to keep it together.
How do you do that in Russian, though? That's the real question.
It translates.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah. And so he turns out he's been like sleeping on hay barges and hasn't been home in 2 weeks. And eventually Raskolnikov will go and meet his family, and they are in really dire straits. And so he leaves him a little bit of money, and then off he goes. Another important thing that happens is he hears a conversation in a pub about a woman who is a pawnbroker. And the woman who's a pawnbroker is old. Yep. She's really mean to her sister, Lizaveta. No, Lizaveta's the pawnbroker.
No, Lizaveta is his sister. The pawnbroker is like Elena something or other.
Yeah.
She's just known as I just call her the pawnbroker.
Yeah, they pretty much call her the pawnbroker through almost the entire book. So Elena, the pawnbroker, and her sister Lizaveta. So the pawnbroker is apparently really miserly, and she's not very nice if you come and you pawn something about giving it back. She's always squeezing the very last penny out of you, and she doesn't help anybody. In fact, it turns out that when she dies, she's going to give all of her money to a monastery so the monastery can pray for her own soul's salvation. That's her plan. So and she's terrible to her sister. Generally, it's thought that she like kind of beats her and abuses her, and this other sister is not fully there.
She's probably retarded. She's probably some sort of mental retardation.
Yeah, some sort of developmental disability.
Right.
And so that she treats her not nice is not a very cool thing.
Right.
So he hears these two guys talking in a bar, and the one guy
about
says,
just a terrible person.
Right.
With a lot of cash.
A terrible person with a lot of cash.
Yes.
And he says, what we should do is we should kill her and then use her cash for everybody else to make everybody's lives better, right? If we can remove her, we're taking away a negative in the society, and we're doing a whole net positive, right? Which is disseminating her cash to bring a whole bunch of people out of poverty.
He says, how many guys would make amazing things in Russian society? They've got new ideas and fresh perspectives, and they just need a little leg up. How many of those guys would benefit from getting her money? This is where I always joke, Thomas, that the real problem with the story of Crime and Punishment is a lack of liquidity. But anyway.
What you really want is a liquid market, right?
Exactly, yeah.
What you really need is like a lending, some lending. Some entrepreneurial lending.
This makes me nervous. Venture capital in Russia. No.
Yes.
Oh, my word.
When you're reading this with the students, do any of them find this argument compelling at this point? Do you all talk about?
Unfortunately, many do.
Oh, yes. Okay. And they will find it compelling for a while.
Because even just having heard you describe it that way, like, there's a logic to what he's saying, right? Like this is what I appreciate about the story, right? He's not painting a villain who's just like
he's not the Joker, chaos for the sake of chaos.
Like, he has reasons for what he's doing, and in his mind they're noble reasons, right?
Yeah.
So far he's just hearing this conversation at a bar. This little like these two guys just having a BS conversation in a bar, being like,
someone should go kill them.
We should ice that girl and get her cash.
Yeah. And so
but very quickly
turns out that these are the same ideas that he's been having himself about this very same person,
right?
This pawnbroker, Elena, how he's going to maybe do the job and take her out. Now, he happens to think that murderers, on the whole, are pretty bad at the business. They can't do it very well. There's a sickness that comes beforehand, and then during the event, just because they don't have their wits about them, they're going to screw it up. But because he's been thinking about the whole thing and he's been planning it out in his head, he's going to do it. He's going to do it better.
That's fine, but
right? He's gonna work this out and really nail it.
that does not happen.
It does not
yeah,
happen.
yeah.
He's mostly kind of sick and spaced out. And then as he's like thinking through this whole thing, should I kill her? Should I not kill her? Is it okay? Is it not okay? He happens upon her sister in the market, who pretty much says she's not going to be at home at 7:00 tomorrow. And at this point, he feels sucked by fate into doing the deed. He knows that the pawnbroker is going to be alone by herself in the apartment and available. And he's even said he's going to come back and pawn a thing in a few days. And so she's primed for him showing up. And so there's all this. No, maybe I'm getting that wrong.
No, you're right.
I'm right? Yeah, I thought I was right. So she knows he's around. He says, I might have something for you in a couple of days. It's a cigarette case. And so he just feels like everything is conspiring him to make him do this thing, to take out the pawnbroker and snag her money. So he goes home and he promptly falls asleep, which is what any good murderer, someone who's planning a heist, should do, is just pass out for a really long time. And then he wakes up and he's like, oh my gosh, it's 6:00 or whatever. It's like an hour or two before it happens. And so he sews a little loop in his jacket, and then he goes and finds an axe and he slips it into the loop so he can walk with his arms free and not have anybody be the wiser that he's just walking around town with an axe.
Yep.
He slips up to her apartment, hands her this wooden block enclosed in paper, and while she's trying to get it open to see this cigarette case, he uses the blunt edge of the axe and he bonks her a few times real good and kills her, and tries to stay away from all the blood. Right. He pulls a little pouch off her neck and tries to grab her keys, and then he goes and he starts rifling through her drawers, and he can't seem to figure out which keys go to which things, and he's really panicking, and he's having a really hard time thinking straight. He gets a few things, jams them into his pockets, and then he's like, wait, maybe she's alive. So he runs back and he looks at her real hard. Yep, she's dead. And so then he runs back and he starts rifling through some stuff again, and then he hears steps in the hall. Right. Steps in the apartment, and he comes back into the room to find the sister, right, Lizaveta, who is horrified at seeing this dead body on the floor. And so he takes his axe and he does the job a second time and kills a second person. We will later find out was pregnant. So all in all, 3 deaths. The whole time the door had been open. Right. He had left it open. And he's cursing himself, and he all of a sudden suspects that he's losing his own dang mind because he can't seem to get the details right, and then he's horrified by this, and what else is he missing? And then he starts, like, he accidentally gets blood all over himself from that second kill, and so now he's got to wash everything off, so he starts washing everything off really frantically, and then he shuts the door, and then locks it, and then some people come, and he basically barely escapes detection by like several twists of fate that let him slip into some doorways and slip behind a passing cart and basically make it out of there without being seen at all. Right. He goes and he drops the axe back off where he found it and then goes back into his room and promptly again falls asleep. So he is not the best murderer, and this sickness that he described that he thought came over criminals absolutely takes over. Right. Yeah, it happens to him. So whether or not the crime causes the sickness or the sickness causes the crime, it's kind of left up to you to decide. Yep. But it happens to him. He is not the murderer that he imagines himself to be.
Don't we eventually find out he missed most of the money also?
Yeah.
So he gets like $10 or whatever. Like he gets way less than he expected to, even for doing whatever. Even for killing these 3 people.
So she had thousands of rubles stashed away, and he probably only got, what would you say, like
100 pounds, 100 rubles.
100 rubles, like nothing even worth the effort, right? She had so much money just shoved away in drawers, and he missed all of it. So we find out the next day as he kind of wakes up that he's been called to the police station. And it freaks him out, obviously. Yeah. But he goes to the police station and finds out his landlady is just suing for rent because he hasn't paid rent in several months because he's a bum and because he doesn't have any money. And he had kind of flirted with her, and there was a promise to marry her daughter that didn't quite work out. And so he thought he had kind of a sweet deal going. Turns out not really. She wants the money because she's got this new guy who's a businessman in her life.
Womp
womp.
And so they start talking about the murder while he's there. And he passes right out, right? It overwhelms him, and out he goes.
Clerks are like talking about the murder in the other room, or they're sort of saying like, "Hey, this person got murdered," and meanwhile, the guy talking to him is like, "Yeah, you need to pay your landlady," and he's listening to them talk about this murder, and he's like, "Oh," just sort of passes out. And one police inspector was like, That's suspicious.
Yeah, exactly. So he kind of puts it together that this kid is doing this. So he goes home, freaks out, realizes he hasn't hidden anything, that the bits of his socks and trousers are still covered in blood, that he's got all of these problems. He shoves them behind his wallpaper. Clearly there's a bulge behind the wallpaper. He just can't seem to get it right. And so in a flurry of effort, he ends up hiding all of the money under a rock in some abandoned lot somewhere. And he's just going to leave it there, right? He's going to leave it there for 2 years until he can go back and get it. And he feels that this is especially clever.
Okay.
And then he goes back home and passes out. He has a friend named Razumikin. Razumikin?
Mm-hmm. Razumikin, yeah.
Razumikin, who is his name in Russian kind of means good sense, or a person that kind of has their life together. And
he is an absolute peach.
He
Is he a
really
good person?
is. He finds Razumikin sick and then nurses
Raskolnikov.
him. Yeah, Raskolnikov sick and nurses him back to health. And at the same time, takes some rubles that he had left over and goes and buys him like a really nice suit and presents it in the most adorable way ever. He's like, "What would you think I got for these pants? You might say 10 rubles. You may say 20 rubles. It was 8." And then he'll like show them. And he's like, "Look, they don't even have that many holes." And it is adorable. He gets him a hat and he's like, "This isn't one of those shabby hats. It's a good hat from a good hat seller."
You say, how do they know each other?
They
College
went to school
buddies.
together.
They're there, okay.
Yeah, they're old college buddies. So he starts to nurse him back to health. At the same time, Raskolnikov had received. Let's see. I'm wondering how deeply to go into all of this. Where are we
I
on the
wouldn't
podcast?
worry about the Dunya letter losing thing.
Yeah, I was wondering if I should. Oh yeah, okay. Well, I don't have enough time for that. So there's a whole sub plot about
His
his
sister's
sister
getting married to a
this
dirtbag
doofus.
for money, and yeah.
Yeah,
And she's a noble creature that has to do this because Raskolnikov's inability to finish being a student has cast his family into poverty.
right. So all of this stuff kind of happens to him as he is sick and having problems, and everyone thinks that he's in some sort of weird psychological daze, and doctors come and see him, and every once in a while he'll sneak out and do something. One time he goes and thinks about committing suicide, but sees a woman drown herself instead, and he's like, well, that doesn't seem like a very fun way to go, so he doesn't do that. And he goes and revisits the scene, which is obviously a really bad idea, starts asking about where all the blood went, and people are like, well, that seems awfully suspicious. And then Jellyman, remember the guy he met in that pub,
Yes.
dies. And Raskolnikov kind of gets in touch with his daughter, Sonia. And his daughter, Sonia, because that guy had a penchant for spending all the family's money, had turned to prostitution. It was something she had to do to keep her family alive. And so she would be a prostitute. She had a little yellow ticket that meant she was a prostitute, and she would send all of the money to her family, right? She lived with barely anything in a nasty, weird, oblong apartment with all funny angles, and all of her money was going to the family because Jellyman was going to spend it all. So Raskolnikov meets this girl.
And she is meek and mild and good-natured, and
She's a wonderful, wonderful person.
and
She is
she-
sacrificing herself for the good of her family.
but she's sort of meek and timid because of the cruel world she has to circle in.
Sure.
Right. And so Raskolnikov feels for this girl, and he really feels for the family of Marmaladov, and he routinely will give money to them. We actually see a weird, generous streak in Raskolnikov. He'll give money to people who are downtrodden, girls that need help. He'll just leave huge sums of money that he could have used for all kinds of good things, right? Weirdly enough, he wanted to get money in the first place
Right.
to start some campaign of goodness, and he just keeps on giving away money that isn't his to give away. It's usually from his mom.
Yeah, he was supposed to like take this cash and make something of himself, and then
He's just
Gives
giving
it
it
all
away.
away.
he's just giving it all away
Does the book-
because his natural charity shines through. And then,
Oh.
but in those scenes where he gives it away, then he'll get really mad at himself. He's like, "Bah, what am I doing this for? This is ridiculous. I'm,
3% of the population has to go to prostitution every year anyway.
yeah." He's like, "Oh, I'm an alpha male. Why am I giving away all this money?" Right? Like he sort of.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, does the book interpret it as charity, or is he giving away too much? Is it clear?
No,
that
it's charity.
It
It's
is?
pretty
Okay.
clearly charity. Yeah.
even though he gives it away for it's not bad reasons.
It's good reasons. We simply see a split nature, and his name in Russian actually means split.
Okay.
So we see a compulsion to be generous and good and help people, and then the immense instant regret of those actions as he applies his own philosophy to his own
what he
mind,
just did, yeah.
which we will meet in a second.
Okay.
So There, all sorts of stuff happens, and it's kind of the slow progression of the case against him as he sticks his foot in all kinds of cow pies. Like once he takes one of the inspectors to a bar, and he's like, here's what I would have done if I was the murderer. I would take all the money. I would hide it under a rock. You'd never find it. Here's what else I would do. I would do it with something like an axe. He just gives all these details and really freaks the guy out. And obviously the guy's like, all right. So he passes out in the police station while they're talking about it. And now he's like giving me all these crazy details.
Raskolnikov would have had a home on like certain subreddits. Like I sometimes think about what Raskolnikov would be like if he had the internet, or if the internet sort of has this proclivity to create people who are like Raskolnikov, who have a like inflated sense of their own abilities and take like a particular kind of joy of being like an outsider to civil society.
Yeah, and he'll sort of like taunt people with it, and then alternatively think, I'm so good at this, and then all of a sudden like, oh my gosh, I'm terrible, I'm forgetting all sorts of details. Oh no, and then he'll sort of pass out and sleep for 4 hours. Yeah.
It's like, I'm so dark, I'm so bad. I'm on the outside.
Is there blood on my shoes?
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Because he does have guilt. Like he does feel bad about what he did, even though his philosophy says he shouldn't. Right? Doesn't he? Because he doubles down on this, like, I did the right thing, right?
The whole book, he doubles down on it intellectually.
Yes.
But then it's almost like his own soul is crying out against his intellectual sin or his intellectual mistake.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so then you get this war inside where he feels naturally charitable to people, but then intellectually he's like, I am their betters. I should be rising above this and using my cash to like make myself great, like Napoleon.
Yeah. Okay. So we're actually going to get to that theory in just a sec. Okay. So he eventually goes and visits the home of Porphyry, the investigator, who is Graham's favorite character.
He's I think he's a hero of mine.
I feel like we always talk about what characters we are in the books, and I don't know. I think Porphyry is a pretty good character for you.
Appreciate it.
Right?
He's played by Ian McDermott,
the guy who
plays Emperor Palpatine.
Yeah.
He plays him in the BBC version of Crime and Punishment. And
just nails it.
Really? It's good?
Yes.
It's great. I mean, the only thing is that Porphyry is supposed to be about 35, and he's not 35. But in every other detail, it's awesome.
Why do you like Porphyry so much, Graham?
I like him for a very specific scene that comes at the end of the book.
Okay.
Where he tells Raskolnikov, he's like, I'm going to arrest you in a couple of days, but I'm giving you this opportunity to save your soul. There's a certain kind of just like Porphyry, he's just got like a keen sense into the human, into like the psychology of the criminal, which is not something that I necessarily find all that interesting. But the fact that he's got this profound sense into the motivations of people, and
also a concern for those who are not necessarily his favorite people.
That's right. And then also a concern for the soul of the people who are all like got their heads all turned into this like dark philosophy of theirs.
But he doesn't like Raskolnikov.
Raskolnikov is not a likable guy.
Yes, sure.
Only Razumikin likes Raskolnikov, and heaven knows why.
Yeah.
That's good. Okay. So he's
pretty much a pain to everybody else. So at one point, Raskolnikov and Razumikin both go to visit Porphyry in his parlor.
Okay.
And it's under the guise of Raskolnikov asking about some of the things that he pawned to the pawnbroker, right? If everybody else comes looking for the things they pawned and he's the only one who doesn't, it looks really suspicious. So he decides he's going to go look for the things that he pawned.
Porphyry spends the whole book wearing a smoking jacket, house coat, which is another reason why I love him.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought that was some kind of hint.
Okay. He's like a police inspector, and he goes around like looking all
smoking a pipe and drinking a cup of tea and wearing like a smoker's jacket.
Yeah, like he kind of like wears slippers all the time. Yeah, he's so great. And so they go to he brings up an article that Raskolnikov wrote. It turns out several months earlier, and it got published. And Raskolnikov had no idea it had gotten published, and it outlines his theory about the criminal. And one of the things that it's sort of in the subtext of the actual article, but it's brought out in conversation by Porphyry to sort of plumb exactly the motivations of Raskolnikov. Yes. And we call it great man theory. And
he might have just titled the article like "Murdering Old Ladies, Not a Big Deal." That's essentially what it is.
Does he get that specific in there? Not to the degree about old women, but
not to the.
But he is talking about
wading through a sea of blood is, I think, a line in the paper.
So it's not great.
Yeah.
So here's the basic theory: there are two types of people in this world. There are the extraordinary people who are capable of doing or saying something new. And then there are the people who are regulars, like like me.
normies.
The normies. Their job is to reproduce and keep the world going, and they live according to the rules, and they enjoy living according to the rules. They don't break laws, and they like it that way.
And they are scared and mistrustful of the great men.
Yes, and so his theory is that the great man, if he has to do something, like if he has he calls it a new word to bring to society, then if there are obstacles in his way preventing him from bringing this new word to society that would move it forward, he is allowed to give himself the moral allowance to do anything that is necessary to bring that to society. Mm-hmm. And it has to be in proportion to his idea. So if his idea is like a new way to change a tire, like that's the things he could do is maybe like steal a couple of dollars from a neighbor. But if it's like, this is going to change the way that we view the universe and the way that we make all of our machines, and it's like the invention of toilet paper, then he can like sacrifice several lives to do it. He can give himself the moral right. Now, that doesn't mean he's not going to feel bad about it.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that society won't punish him for it. In fact, he probably will be punished for it. The society is going to have a backlash against him overstepping these laws. But they will probably kill him.
Yeah, but he won't feel bad.
He won't. He might feel bad, but he can allow himself
to do it
within himself to overstep those obstacles. And they'll even probably praise him 2 generations from now, right? He'll be remembered as a great man who moved things forward, but
Does
probably
he point
kill
to
him.
Examples? Is this?
Yes. So he brings up, and one of the reasons he thinks this is because some of the greatest men who have moved things forward are people who have by necessity broken laws. To bring a new law, you must by your nature bring a criminal and break the old laws, the things that were cherished by your fathers. So he brings up Lycurgus, the founder of Sparta. To found Sparta, he had to abandon some other law and establish a new one, meaning he was a lawbreaker and he was bloodthirsty. The dude did wars.
Right.
Solon, a great Athenian. I don't know why he brought up Solon, because Solon is a pretty peaceful guy.
Right.
But then he brings up Napoleon and Muhammad, and they were establishing a new law, a new way for man to be.
Yep.
And to do that, they had to break some old law.
He says if Isaac Newton was in the position where his theory of gravity and calculus or whatever was going to be hindered by somebody, Isaac Newton would have the moral right within himself to remove that person so that his new mathematical proofs of the universe could come forward.
Not that he's obligated to break laws all the time, just
Not
if it's
any
necessary.
law, just anything that's getting in the way of your thing.
Of him being able to.
So it's not like you can, feel good about like blowing through stop signs wherever you go.
Sure.
But as long as those stop signs are hindering you on your progress towards a greater future,
But is
then
it
you
actually?
can.
Does he actually go further than that? Is it actual? Would Newton have an obligation in that situation to do whatever it takes for his ideas to be shared, or is it just he could choose?
If Newton knows he's a great man, then he does have an internal obligation.
So the only way to know is you yourself know if you're great or
Yes.
not.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So
And-
there's nothing wrong with this, right?
Or you test yourself.
Yeah. Good. Is that true? There's a test? Wait.
So he even says,
Is there a test? There's a special birthmark.
Oh, is that?
That's what Porphyry
Porphyry
says.
asks-
Does he actually say that? Really?
jokes.
the next question
He's
is, what if there's a mix-up? What if one of the
so
normies
funny.
thinks
Yeah.
that he's a Grady? And is there like a birthmark, or are there special stars they're born under, or what's the deal
Because
here?
Porphyry's like, I have the utmost respect for these great men, but I'm a little nervous
make
about
sure,
how many
yes.
of them there are.
yeah, because they're out
They're
there.
running around killing people.
Yeah.
I'm
Well, I wanna
I'm
be
a
sure,
police
yes.
inspector, so I just want to know. And yeah.
And Raskolnikov
he's awesome.
says, well, it happens a lot. People think that they're greater than their station, and they go off to accomplish one of these things. And usually what happens is they don't amount to much because they're not great. Their word wasn't actually new in the first place, or they don't have the capacity to accomplish it. So they will punish themselves, and their brethren around them will punish them. Yeah. So they won't succeed. They'll try and they'll fail, revealing their non-greatness. And it happens all the time, and it's not really a big deal. People try to accomplish things. It's like people try to start businesses that they think are great, and it just doesn't go anywhere, right?
You don't kill people when you start businesses, but it depends on the business, I guess.
Depends on what kind of conspiracy theory news you're reading.
Good, great.
So this is his great man theory, that there are those among us who have the internal right to break these laws. And if you're feeling uncomfortable with this, I might hearken back to the American revolutionaries, right? They felt it was necessary to pull down a law, a cherished law, the veneration of the British king, in order to establish a new law. They were revolutionaries. They broke laws. They were, from the perspective of the British crown, criminals, right? There are many of these. Julius Caesar, also a criminal. He broke a lot of laws. You can't cross the river with an army bringing them into Rome. You're not allowed to do that. You are also not allowed to kill other senators, right? Just randomly if you want to. He broke some laws. Napoleon also broke some laws, right? Actually, I don't know if Napoleon broke a lot of laws. He certainly shed a lot of blood.
He was exiled once and returned, so
probably that law.
Exiled a second time, so at least at that point. But yes.
I don't think Newton shed a lot of blood, but he certainly brought new ideas that no one had thought before, right? I can't help but think of Galileo, right? He got in a big trouble for his whole "we aren't at the center of things" idea, right? So if you are railing against this, you have to come to grips with the notion that a lot of the men that we believe are great were lawbreakers in themselves.
Doesn't that miss the point, though? Like, those people weren't saying, I'm special, therefore I'll do whatever I want to. Because there has to be some, like, commensurate... Ideas have consequences, and I agree with that part of it, but you...
That's normie talk there.
Is that
Thomas?
how this works?
No.
Yeah. Well, as not a great man, sorry, I guess I'm not one of the two great men on this podcast. I apologize. But yeah, again, I'm sure this is being set up as like for us to be able to then critique it.
Well, I mean, the fact is that this is garbage and isn't a real thing. Like, this isn't the way the universe works.
Why not? Tell me why it's wrong.
Because again, this is my question of like, because those people did have to break laws. Sometimes, again, what started America led to bloodshed, right? And people had to be okay with that.
Yeah. My point is that Lycurgus and Caesar and Napoleon and Isaac Newton are not vacuums or islands. That like, it's not their life is a series of pitches and swings, and they made contact. And I'm not saying that it was a completely random choice, a random chance. I'm just saying that like something like a Sparta was going to happen somewhere. And so it's not that Lycurgus has a moral ability to break laws. It's just that when we look back, we say, Lycurgus did this. But when it's actually unfolding in front of you, you can't say, Lycurgus is going to do this, therefore we can justify his murder or justify his
Nobody
crimes.
around needs to. Only Lycurgus needs to know
was.
that his mission is a good one, and he clearly did.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then there's a problem then when you have everybody who thinks this way.
Sure. But the same point is what Graham just said, that these aren't just individuals acting as if they are great men, right? You're saying these are like larger social forces that agree certain changes need to happen, and then there are consequences to those decisions.
I'm not saying that there's no great people in history. I'm just wondering how cognizant of their greatness they are when they're doing the thing.
Doesn't
or how
matter.
much of that driver it is. It doesn't matter?
I don't think it matters. I think according to Raskolnikov's theory, like I don't need to think as I'm doing it, I am a great man. I need to think this law needs to be broken because my purpose is a grand one. And that makes me great.
So then it is a belief of praising the iconoclast or praising the contrarian who has a better vision of how things should go.
Sure.
Which I can get
Iconoclast,
behind. I can
maybe not.
understand that. Yeah. Maybe, the contrarian,
the revolutionary is probably a better word.
Yeah.
They don't just pick the opposite side. They want to change things, according to Raskolnikov, for the better and move the world forward. Sorry, I'm playing devil's advocate here.
Totally fine.
I want to give instead of dismissing it offhand, I want to not do a straw man here and give his theory its real due, because the book itself never gives you the solution to this theory. It never solves it for you. It only solves it metaphorically, which is one of the criticisms.
It's just metaphorical.
It's one of the criticisms of Dostoyevsky, right? With his Inquisitor criticism, it never intellectually solves it for you. It solves it spiritually, right?
It's Russian history solves it for you.
Yes.
But even Crime and Punishment answers this question. Raskolnikov, I guess, would you just
Ruin
say
it.
he wasn't a...
Spoil it.
No, not to that. He has had the sickness that comes after murder already at this point. Like, are you questioning just whether was he just not great in the first place?
Well, that's the thing. I think the
yeah.
easy way is to apply this theory and say, well, he's not a great man. He made a mistake. His idea was not a new one. He didn't have a new idea. There was nothing grand driving him. The only idea he had at best was this. And this isn't even that new of an idea. They even talk about it when the article comes up, right? That a lot of this has been said before.
Yeah.
His only question was whether or not he was great, and he was wrong. He even admits to that later in the book. He says, I wanted to dare. I wanted to see if I was Napoleon, and he is tortured by the notion that he is wrong. So if we are to correctly apply the theory, He is torturing himself.
Right.
He is punished by his fellows, and he did not accomplish his goal. The only conclusion you can make is that he was not originally a great man.
He's a normie.
He's a normie.
And he's real cheesed off about it.
And so even the book doesn't really solve the theory for you.
Sure.
That doesn't mean the theory is wrong. It just means
Sure.
he's on the wrong side of it.
Sure. There still seems something like, again, that it's centered on one person's idea of what great change should look like. Just doesn't do credit to there is a Russian identity. The right answer for what Russia should do is not made by, it's not only made by individuals.
But individuals are involved.
Of course they are. But again,
There's the right person at the right time, and all the social conditions have come together. And
it's just because we do need great thinkers putting forward great ideas. It's the bloodshed that then gets, instead of it being then moving to persuasion, or then moving to how do I incorporate other people's ideas to bring about this change? It's that force is the only way to do it. That I think that's the.
He said overstep obstacles. If those obstacles can be overstepped with rhetoric, I think he'd be fine with that. But there are those that can't. The American Revolution is perhaps an example.
But that's
the
different.
abolition of slavery.
But that's different than, I mean, there were still royalists who lived in the United States that weren't all killed for their disagreement. There is something fundamentally different from. There was not a force for 100% agreement on these issues.
No, they overstepped obstacles to the accomplishment of their goal, which
Yeah.
I still think is what Raskolnikov has asked for.
Yeah. And again, I mean, that's where there would be boundaries on because again, for change to happen, obstacles must be overcome.
Mm-hmm.
It's at the point where violence is brought in that some type of boundary has been overstepped. Again, I think that's where, again, this is what I appreciate in Dostoyevsky, that like it's complicated. There's a lot of truth to what he's saying, but he goes too far.
So would you say that violence is never appropriate?
No, I'm
overstep
not a
an obstacle
pacifist.
for an
I would
idea?
not begrudge someone who is for saying that. Yeah, I don't know how I would. Yeah, and this is a broader. I would tend to be more comfortable with violence that's in self-defense as opposed to initiated, but that's probably a bigger separate conversation.
Sure.
Yeah, again, I think that's the. It is not so. If Raskolnikov in the beginning had gone to the pawnbroker and said, "Hey, here's this cause that if you donated your money to, we could like change the city," and persuaded her to do it, that she is an obstacle still, but it's overcome through rhetoric, not through violence.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? He would still accomplish his goal, but it wouldn't involve killing her. That's the part that is a problem.
Oh yeah, I think we can all agree that Raskolnikov is a total doofus.
Yes, sure.
And that maybe it doesn't apply his force in the right ways.
Yes.
There are times when force was appropriate, right? Some of Caesar's goals could not be accomplished without force.
Right. It's also hard. This is a separate episode I want to do at some point, and just because we're 10 minutes before the end of this one, but like
We only have 10 minutes left?
13 if you're counting.
Great golly.
Yeah, like the it's hard for us to even look back and understand the use and appropriate use of violence. Like to read Beowulf, violence is a necessity because it's a different age and social structure than we have now. This will be a separate topic for another time, but yeah, I think violence is the point where I'm pushing back on for this.
it was super cool.
What was?
Yeah, shields and swords and
Yeah, but also people died all the time and
fair point.
in combat, so that was not great. You want to
Donaldson?
No, I'm just saying, like,
What's your problem with it? I don't have a problem with the violence. I think some goals are violently achieved, right? The end of Nazi Germany was violently achieved. And the establishment of the American nation, not that necessarily America is a good in and of itself, but many people regard that as a good move, and it was achieved with violence.
I have a hard time ascribing like a view of history that sort of says we've got this sort of upward slanting slope of progress towards betterment, and if there are impediments on that slope that need to be overcome by violence, then we do them.
So
You need to, for Raskolnikov's view to work, you need to have a low view of people. So, like, the pawnbroker would not be convinced if you talk to her. And you need to have a hope in the future. And you need to have a view that the problems in the world that exist can be solved by reorganizing the systems, that exist. And
Can many of the problems of the world not be solved by reorganizing a system?
No, like the fundamental problems?
if the fundamental problems can't, the problems that can be reorganized that will benefit human beings I don't think need to be solved by violence, except when it's like the examples that you've given, like a belligerent nation who is like a Nazi Germany who is actually trying to enact Raskolnikov's ideas in the world. The American Revolution against England.
It matters that the violent portion of the revolution was started by the British, right? That they fired the first shot. Like, isn't that I think that changes some of it. Same with the World War II example, that violence was done before even America entered into World War II. We entered because of Pearl Harbor, ultimately. So an attack on Americans then triggered a response there. So,
And there's also the liberation of the Bastille, the French Revolution.
yeah.
Like there are innumerable times when violence has that after the fact we see the violence as a good thing.
Yeah, but that's again, maybe we're all kind of trying to get to the same point. Violence is the first course of option, is what is troubling. Again, I'm focused on the Raskolnikov incident. He did not entertain other options. He jumped straight to, I'm going to go kill the lady.
Well, that's because he wanted to see if he could do it. He just wanted to see if he could do it, if he could dare to step above everybody else, if he was Napoleon, right? That's why he didn't consider anything else, is because nothing else would have proved to him that he was great.
Yeah, that scene that you're referring to, as he's confessing the murders to Sonia, he says, I wanted to see if I had what it took. I wanted to dare. I wanted to see if I had the cojones to kill somebody.
And he didn't.
And I did, but I couldn't deal with it.
Right.
Yeah. So in other words, so it was more like the murder was a litmus test to see if he was great, as opposed to a first step of a entrepreneurial plan.
All right.
But the great men are not proved by their act. Again, they're not proved by their act of violence. They're proved by the direction in which they're pointing the country, the group of people, whatever to. It's not proven in, can I kill for the sake of my vision, right?
So I think
they get caught up in a thing that they can't get out of, and then they end up being the center point of that thing. And then when historians look back, they're like, man, Napoleon.
But that's not always true. I think there are people who push for revolution. So Thomas, I think you've touched on the way that I've solved it for myself, which is,
let's go.
One of the things that Raskolnikov doesn't address is a cohesive vision of the future. He keeps on talking about moving the world forward and improving things and moving the world. He even uses the word goal, like moving the world toward its goal. But he never talks about what that is. Yeah. And without a clear vision of the future, then you never know if a great man is actually contributing or detracting. Right. You end up with what one of my students pointed out was chaos. If I'm a great man and you're a great man and I'm willing to kill to get my thing done and you're willing to kill to get your thing done, we might end up just killing each other. Or I'll kill a lot of your friends, you'll kill a lot of my friends, which doesn't help. And so for Raskolnikov, the right to overstep boundaries is in accordance with your idea. And I think he's close to the truth. I think another one of my students a couple of years ago, if you're listening, great job, buddy, is he said, there are no great men, only great purposes. And what he pointed out was that most of these great men have not done the things on their own. There are a few, Newton, right? But a lot of them had huge followings, massive armies, and put themselves at risk. They weren't just sacrificing other people. They risked the sacrifice of themselves. Julius Caesar is one of these, right? Napoleon is one of these. Lycurgus is one of these. All of those men were willing to sacrifice themselves. So clearly, what they were sacrificing themselves was a purpose. And this reminds me of a G.K. Chesterton thing. One of the reasons that he thinks that the church is important is because it gives a cohesive, unmoving vision for what the future should look like, what a perfect world looks like. So real progress is made only if we pursue that. And so I think, Thomas, what you touched on is that the idea of the man doesn't matter. Right. It's what he's pointing to. And I'm going to liken this back to the Tao, a central vision for the future, right? The reason that America rebelled is because they saw something unfair in the law. The law was not adhering to the way that man should be organized, right? It wasn't right. Something was wrong. And then Lycurgus established a law, not because he was overthrowing an old one, but because he had a group of people that needed rule, right? Napoleon saw a France in turmoil, and he tried to unite France to make it a better place to live, or at least in the beginning, and then widen his his territory. And so really, what these men are doing is not like bringing their own new idea. What they are trying to do is get the world to adhere better to what C.S. Lewis calls the Tao, right?
Sure.
The way that the world should function, a singular vision of utopia. And at some point, if a nation is way off of that utopia, if, say, people are being abused, everyone is poor, everything is terrible, maybe revolution and violence is necessary, right? Those rules must be broken because they are evil rules, right? So I would say that it is not the level of your idea that gives you the right to overstep obstacles. I would say that it is the goodness of your purpose that allows you to move forward. And you can overstep obstacles who are truly evil, right?
Yep.
Things that are bad for the world and bad for man.
Yep.
And so what Raskolnikov did worked with his theory, but it doesn't work with that theory. Did killing the pawnbroker actually bring more good into the world? No. It made the world way worse.
Yep.
Did it align with how man should function? No. Was there a cohesive vision for utopia? No. All of those things are broken. That's how I solve it for myself.
Yeah, I like it, except there's also, when you think of the ultimate righteous cause had violence, but it was violence done on the great man.
Yes. And so
So then in that sense, like, I don't know. So then we're talking about the gospel, like,
Yes.
the gospel.
Yeah.
So then this is kind of like the question of the Grand Inquisitor, which is probably the closest podcast that is a sister to this one that we're talking about. And that's what the Grand Inquisitor is asking Jesus. He's like, you had the power to like alleviate all this suffering. Why did you not? And so I don't know. I just don't, knowing that Dostoyevsky is, Eastern Orthodox committed man to the gospel. How does that fit into?
Well, I think it fits in that, as I pointed out, many of these men were willing to sacrifice their own lives for the good, right?
Yes.
And like many of them were. Julius Caesar fought at the forefront. He never rested. He was in the field with his men. And his purpose was not necessarily the one that was going to do the most good for man. And like C.S. Lewis...
Maybe Napoleon's wasn't either.
Yeah, but like C.S. Lewis points out, right, there are obviously misunderstandings about what is good for man and good for the world, and people will fight for that thing, but they're not fighting for an idea that, like, I don't know, they're how great we see them will be how well that adheres to the Tao, I think. And that is what allows them the ability to step forward. It is not like their cojones. It's how great is the pull of that purpose.
Yep. I do still worry that then you get utopian thinkers who, well, utopia is perfect, therefore much violence is allowed. Correct? Wouldn't that fit with what you're...
Well, if violence is a piece of that utopia, and I think that we see that happen. Like, people fight for what they think is a utopian world, and maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but I think they're evaluated not on, like, do they have the right in themselves? The question is not do they have the right, but does their purpose give them license to do the things that they've done?
Yeah.
And are the laws that they're breaking evil laws that hurt man, or good laws that help man?
Sure.
Yeah, how much violence would actually need to happen to eliminate all crime in New York City? Like all crime, every single piece of crime.
Everyone until there's only one person there, right?
And or how many freedoms would need to be curtailed,
Exactly.
and these sorts of things. Right. So,
yeah. So that's how I've answered it for myself. I'm fairly comfortable with the answer. I think it's an all right one, and I'm glad I'm going to post this for my students after they revise their great man papers.
Good.
So
Smart.
If you're listening to this and you're a senior,
Nice try.
Joke's on you. But yeah, that's kind of the way I
Do you
figure it
want
out.
to cover the end of the book also? Do you want to keep going?
Well, we've got 2 minutes left. I feel bad just flat out spoiling it for everybody.
Great.
There's so much more in this book. I was actually hoping to get to the point where Dostoyevsky himself outlines the idea of the novel in 3 points in his notes at the end of the book.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow. Say them.
Are you interested?
Yeah.
So, the idea of the novel, as it's entitled in his notes.
Wow.
Number 1, orthodox view, what orthodoxy is. I don't know how that relates. I think that's a question for another time. How does
Cool.
orthodoxy relate to the novel? Number 2, there is no happiness in comfort. Happiness is purchased by suffering. We see this again and again. Sonia, the prostitute, he actually says on the page opposite of what I'm reading, it says, Svidrigailov is despair, the most cynical. He's a character you meet late in the book that is kind of like the working out of Raskolnikov's theories. If Raskolnikov has succeeded, he'd be this guy.
And he's got the luckiest, cushiest life you could
Ever.
imagine. Anytime he does something stupid, like he just gets a Deus Ex Machina salvation and gets to like
Everything works out.
live happy.
Sonia,
And he's miserable.
Sonia is hope, the most unrealizable. And so Sonia is hope, Svidrigailov is despair, and Raskolnikov is caught between these two extremes. Number 3, man is not born for happiness. Man earns his happiness, and always by suffering. There is no justice there for knowledge and consciousness of life, i.e. directly felt by body and soul, i.e. by all life process. So this is clearly a notebook, right? Not all of it's going to make full sense.
Sure.
Is acquired by experience pro and contra, which one must get through one's own, by suffering. Such is the law of our planet. But that direct knowledge, felt by life process, is such a great joy that one can pay for it by years of suffering. So your consciousness of life, your salvation is bought by suffering, by experiencing the process of life. In his image in the novel is expressed the idea of extraordinary pride, arrogance, and contempt for all society. His idea is to take that society into his power. Despotism is a trait of his. It goes to meet him. So those 3 ideas. What orthodoxy is, I don't really know how that connects. He's not very clear. Number 2, there is no happiness in comfort. It's purchased by suffering. And 3, man is not born for happiness. Man earns his happiness, and always by suffering. There's not a great difference between 2 and 3. Sure, clearly a notebook, right?
Yeah. One thing I've heard about Russian literature is people say, okay, English literature, I will die for honor. French literature, I will die for love. American literature, I will die for freedom. Russian literature, I will die.
That's good.
I love it.
I like it.
All right, that's. I hope that was good.
great.
That was good.
for me.
Thank you.
Good stuff. Well, this has been Classical Stuff You Should Know. You know where to find us. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye.
Yep.